Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 9th in our new series of Canadian Friends of Peace Now webinars. My name is Lara Gallagher, and I'm the National Chair of Canadian Friends of Peace Now. We are very honored to have as our guest to our Free Foundation for Middle East Peace. As always, we welcome audience questions. So please, what I'd like you to do is type in your questions at any time during this webinar using the Q&A feature on the Zoom toolbar, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat for the questions because I won't be monitoring the chat that closely. Once again, use the Q&A feature. Now this event is being recorded, so you will be able to see it again later too. Before we begin the webinar itself, I just want to say a few words about Canadian Friends of Peace Now. Our organization is a partner to Peace Now in Israel. Shalom Achshav, as it's known in Hebrew, promotes a just and viable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the formula of 2 states for 2 peoples. Shalom Achshav protests the occupation, and particularly it monitors, raises awareness of, and protests the expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Here in Canada, we promote a deeper understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we promote the Shalom Achshav message here, and we also contribute funds for educational programs in Israel. Now, we can't do any of that without your help. So if you are able, please consider making a gift to Canadian Friends of Peace Now. You can go to our website at www.peacenowcanada.org and click on the donate button. For any donation over $10, we'll send you a tax receipt. Okay, and now I'd like to turn things over to our Toronto board member, Jacqueline Swartz, who will introduce our guest and be our main moderator for the evening. Over to you, Jacqueline.
Okay, thanks, Gabriella. Well, as we all know, America is on the brink of an historic election. And the results, of course, will reverberate far beyond US borders. So tonight, we're looking at the consequences for Israel, for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for the Jewish community. And we are very happy to have our guest, Lara Friedman, to enlighten us. Lara Friedman is president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, which promotes a just resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a grants program, public programming, and research. And before joining it, she was director of policy and government relations at Americans for Peace Now. Before that, she was a US Foreign Service officer who served in Jerusalem, Washington, Tunis, and Beirut. So she's had more than 25 years of experience working in the Middle East, in the foreign policy arena, with particular expertise on the Israel-Arab conflict, Israel settlements, Jerusalem, and the role of the US Congress. She has published widely and is regularly consulted by many, including members of Congress and their staffs. In addition, she's a contributing writer for Jewish Currents and a non-resident fellow at the US Middle East Project. So, Lara, I will begin by asking you the burning questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Again, please type your questions in the Q&A box, not into the chat. So at this tumultuous point, what effect are the US elections having on Israel and the Middle East? We've always heard that there are many pro-Trump supporters in Israel, Is this changing? If so, is this change reflected in the demonstrations in Israel?
Well, thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you, Gabriella, and Canadian Friends of Peace Now. I have to say, after my years at Americans for Peace Now, I feel like I'm really back with family. So thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure. You started with a really big question, and I'm not positive I can answer it completely. I'm not in Israel. Obviously, I'm in Washington, D.C. But you know, it's clear when the U.S. goes to elections in any context, the period people are anticipating what the results are going to be is a very there's a lot of emotion that goes along with that, and a lot of speculation, whether it's in the United States or anywhere in the world. So you know, obviously in the U.S. There's a lot at stake in this election. I'm with a nonpartisan organization. I'm not going to make any statement about who should win or who I hope would win, but clearly the results of this election will impact U.S. policy in the Middle East, and with Israel in particular. There are a lot of people who look at the Trump administration's approach to Israel-Palestine and who are celebrating it, including American Jews who are largely Democrats, who say this is fantastic. He moved the embassy. He's not clashing with Israel, all that stuff. That is a portion of the American Jewish community. Most of the American Jewish community, though, looking at polls, is still strongly supportive of the two-state solution, is deeply concerned about the direction the policy is going, is deeply concerned about anti-Semitism, and this strange deal that the Trump administration is sort of trying to force on the United States and the Jewish community, which says, you know, you can't call me an anti-Semite, I'm really good on Israel. Which is a very awkward argument, you know, and essentially accusing American Jews who are Democrats of not being pro-Israel enough, or even being self-hating because they don't look at him and say, well, you're great on Israel. By the way, many of us don't think he's great on Israel. We think our policy is very problematic. Either way, that is something that is very much in play in this election. Looking at the polls, though, you know, very few American Jews vote on Israel. And this is if you go to the American Jewish Committee's annual polling that they do, or any of the other major polling, American Jews vote on a whole range of issues. Israel is not at the top of the list. And American Jews who do vote on Israel are already very conservative and probably inclined to vote for Trump anyway. But what's at stake? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
So what's at stake? So what's at stake here is obviously bigger than Israel-Palestine. On the Israel side, you know, if you look at polling, there was polling that came out this week, which says, like, you know, more than 60% of Israelis, you know, think Trump is great for Israel and hope he's reelected. And you know, you sort of look at that and think, well, they're not Americans, and most of them don't vote in American elections. So how relevant is that? But it does underscore the gulf that has opened up between the worldview of many Israelis and the worldview of most American Jews. This gulf between what American Jews see as the support for you know, a liberal democratic rule of law, all of that, and Israelis sort of embracing illiberalism if it's good for Israel. And that gulf doesn't appear to be getting any smaller right now.
Even with the demonstrations in Israel.
The demonstrations in Israel are fascinating. And in some ways, you know, I was talking to someone about this the other day. There's something here that's a little reminiscent about the protests that we had some years back around, you know, the economics and cottage cheese and all of that, where, I mean, there is a genuine, you know, something that's ferment in Israel, right? Against corruption. It's about Bibi and all. But it isn't about, you know, that sits side by side with 60-some% of Israelis saying Trump is good for Israel. You know, if you think about the Peace Now approach, which says it's not good for Israel to essentially, you know, egg on Israel as it drives off a cliff, you know, friends don't let friends drive drunk kind of thing, right? It's a very different idea of what it means to be pro-Israel. If for years the idea was that, you know, Israel and the US shared democratic values, shared a liberal outlook, tolerance, rule of law, you know, respect for human rights. I mean, I grew up in an era when we defended Israel by saying, we're not saying Israel does everything right, but Israel has this vibrant human rights sector, which it's proud of, and this independent judiciary. And, for the past 10 years, that's been eroded to the point where the Israeli government treats its own human rights and civil society sector as a fifth column that it wants to delegitimize. And, that's something that's very challenging for this interface between progressive American Jews, even those who care very much about Israel, and Israelis who are basically saying, why would you guys vote against Trump? He's awesome. It's a huge disconnect.
Right. And what about the disconnect between some American Jews and other American Jews? Is there a right-wing populism among Orthodox Jews, for instance?
So I would be very careful about generalizing too much on this. I mean, there is certainly a culture, there's a distinction in culture, and polling, again, I would point to the American Jewish Committee because they do very thorough polling. You see certainly a more conservative, politically conservative bent amongst the Orthodox community in the United States. And you have parts of that community that vote solidly Republican. I did an analysis for a think tank about 6 months ago of U.S. Of Jewish Americans and their voting patterns, and you see an increase in some sectors of American Jewish population voting Republican. So far, it's not making much of a difference in key states because it's in places like New York, which are so overwhelmingly Democrat that having a certain area of Orthodox Jews voting conservative doesn't matter. But not that it doesn't matter, but it's not flipping the seats there. The question, though, I draw a distinction between someone who votes more conservatively for various reasons and the very hardline illiberalism that we're seeing in the United States. And that's where you get a real culture break. And there is a division within the American Jewish community. If you look at Tablet today, Tablet magazine, which has an article from Barry Weiss, who people love to look, Barry Weiss celebrating, talking about anti-Semitism. And it's essentially an article denigrating American progressives who don't recognize that they need to stand up and make Israel and Zionism the center of their existence, even if it means standing with more illiberal forces, because the forces of progressivism are, in her view, I don't want to put words in her mouth, you can read it yourself, but effectively the argument is these forces are anti-Semitic because they're not supportive of Israel enough. And if you stand with them, you're standing against your own interests. Whereas most American progressive Jews would say, I care about Israel, but I do not believe that this is a zero sum where in order to support Israel, I must put all of my values, which define me as an American and a Jew, into a box and stick it in the closet. And that seems to be what is sort of being pushed on us in some ways.
Right. Is there a Jewish vote that both parties are considering or trying to woo? Does it matter?
So, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think there is certainly on the Republican side, there has been an effort now in successive elections to shift what they see as a Jewish vote. It's not monolithic, but to shift Jewish Americans to vote for Republicans over Democrats after American Jews have consistently voted, large numbers vote Democrat. And that's explicit. There's articles about it every year. What will it take to move the vote? I think what you see more than an effort to, like I said, the forces that within the American Jewish community that are, that would put Israel or what they see as Jewish interests defined by Israel above all else already vote very conservative. They already vote that way. So the president moving the embassy isn't going to make or break their vote. I think there is a very clear effort we've seen, certainly since the Obama era, to tag the Democratic Party as anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. It hasn't been very successful. I mean, this was tried in both rounds under Obama, where Obama was painted as a stealth Muslim, not trustworthy, and this incredible Islamophobia and racism that went with that. It didn't work. I think the idea that American Jews are the bulk of the American Jewish community at a time when we're seeing, Nazis, resurgent in our country, are going to say, well, yes, but there's members of the House that are too critical of Israel. Democrats, I don't think that's going to shift a lot of votes, but certainly the effort to constantly score points on this. I mean, it's every day. Again, there's an article in Newsweek, an op-ed in Newsweek today, entitled something like, "Why won't Biden, distance himself from the anti-Semites in his party?" Because apparently, unless Democrats attack each other over criticism of Israel, they're going to be called anti-Semitic, while we literally have Nazis, organizing in our country.
Right. Right.
It's an odd moment for sure.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, can you say something about the influence of J Street?
I mean, I'm not sure what to say. J Street is certainly, J Street has now entered the scene as a mainstream political force. It's fascinating. They are very much within the mainstream. If the effort when J Street first came on the scene as a PAC and a political force was to paint them as something that was marginal or anti-Israel, it hasn't worked. I mean, I think, an excellent job building relations on a Hill and building relations with candidates. And, members of Congress and candidates are, I think, largely happy to take their endorsement, which is really amazing. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to see this opening up, right, of the political sphere to accept that. So yeah, they're certainly part of the ecosystem.
Right. Well, although nobody expects you to have a crystal ball, I can't not ask you about the effects of a Biden presidency on Israel. I mean, can you see a rollback of Trump measures like the closing of the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, or the closing of the PLO embassy in the U.S., and of course the effect on Palestinians?
So it's a fair question. It's the question that we all ask ourselves every day. I mean, on the one hand, I'm not super optimistic that a Biden administration would come in and be extremely energetic and courageous in changing the course of U.S. policy. I think if you take them at their word and you look at the statements that Anthony Blinken has made, or in the platform, or, I mean, they've expressed themselves, and basically what it sounds like they want to do is, as best as possible, return to status quo ante on the policy, given with the understanding that there's certain things they're not going to roll back. There's no one's going to close the embassy. It's not going to happen. The amount of political capital it would take to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv, I don't think that's going to happen. Would you see an effort to have something creative that would maybe have some token presence for the Palestinians somewhere else in Jerusalem? I think that's possible. Would you see an effort to come to some agreement that it would allow the PLO mission to reopen in Washington? That's possible. I mean, there's US laws that get in the way. They'd have to find a way to navigate that. They've talked about restarting aid to the Palestinians. Problem is, you've got US laws that get in the way of that again. They'd have to be creative. But, where we are today, there is no return to status quo ante. The Trump administration has moved things so far from where they were when Obama left office. So you can't really roll back to where he started. That's not possible. And beyond that, I should say, why would you want to? I mean, status quo ante is what got us where we are today. My hope is that a Biden administration comes in, recognizes that status quo ante is not attainable, but also recognizes that rather than try to get as close to that as you can and wrap yourself in the warm cloak of, we support the two-state solution, now leave us alone, and by the way, we're not going to criticize Israel, and we'll protect Israel at the UN from criticism, all things they've said already. All that does is play out time until we get to one state anyway. That's where this heads, because on the ground, things are still moving. I think there were 5,000 settlement units moved today in a meeting in Israel, the higher council. I saw a report from Peace Now on this. 5,000 units. That makes this the banner year since Trump came into office. So you can say, well, we've suspended annexation, but de facto annexation continues to move forward. Peace Now documents this every day for the past 50 years. So I have to hope that if he wins and brings in the experienced people that he will, that they don't simply view this from a political calculus that says, what can we do that costs us the least amount of political capital, that lets us say that we're constructive and not worry about what it actually achieves. I hope they can do that.
I mean, do you think he has a team that is, including a possible new ambassador, that is aware of this rush to build settlements and other Trumpian facts on the ground that they're trying to establish, including this dismantling Arab houses in Area C?
Yes. I'm going to say I know he does. I mean, the people that are close, the people around him, and assuming he's elected, we won't know until he's elected and makes appointments who will be whom. But if we're going to take a cue from the people he's surrounding himself with at this point, I mean, Dan Shapiro is one of his main surrogates on this issue. Dan was the ambassador under Obama, and before that was the national security advisor in the National Security Council for Obama, and before that was on the Hill and has been doing this for 30 some years and is living in Israel right now, working in an Israeli think tank. I know that Dan understands all this stuff well because I've briefed him 100 times on this stuff in detail. My colleagues, I've brought Peace Now in, and Danny Seidemann and others. He knows this inside out. The team that has been gathered around Mr. Biden right now is essentially Obama administration Israel-Palestine experts who know this issue really well. The challenge is, if you listen to the way they talk about it, if the lesson they took from the Obama administration experience was it is a mistake to stand up to Israel on anything, it only costs you political capital and you achieve nothing. If that's the lesson they learned, then it doesn't bode all that well for a Biden administration. There are people from the Obama era who strongly believe that Obama's biggest mistake was laying down a marker on settlements and fighting with Bibi on settlements. And if he just hadn't done that, then there could have been progress. And there are people in that era, I sat in the State Department and had people say to me, well, what if we just, decide which settlements are the most problematic and let them build everywhere else? Okay, how does that advance peace? These are things that I worry about, sort of Des Ross, David Makovsky thinking that we've seen in the New York Times for 10 years.
Right. Yes, right. Well, it's really quite thrilling to hear your inside info. I think most of us don't have that. But here's another question about the vote. There are lots of them, I'm sure. Is there a voting bloc? Is there a voting bloc that the Biden people care about or know about?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question. In terms of the Jewish vote, do you mean?
In terms of Arab Americans.
Arab American vote. So absolutely. I mean, look, the Biden, as far as I can tell, the Democratic Party this year, having maybe learned from the last election, I don't think they're neglecting any constituency, right? Mm-hmm. And there is a large and active Arab American constituency. It's organized. And look, we saw this come up around the DNC when we had the Democratic National Convention, and there were people who took shots at the Biden camp because an Arab American, very outspoken activist who is vilified by some elements in the Jewish community as an anti-Semite. I do not believe she's an anti-Semite. I believe she's a proud Palestinian and holds views that are different than mine, and that's her right. But regardless, her presence at a side meeting was used as a weapon to attack the Biden camp. And initially, their response was to throw her under the bus. And I don't know what sort of feedback they got, but that proved untenable. They eventually issued some sort of apology, not to her, but to the community, or a clarification to try to sort of, assuage, deeply hurt feelings. That tells me they are responsive. And I'll say,
go ahead.
As I would add as well, I mean, look, one of the arguments I would say, I am a very progressive American Jew. Let's be clear. No one has any illusions about that. I would argue that in successive elections, the Democratic Party has made clear they take my vote for granted. They don't care at all about my concerns. They take it absolutely for granted that no matter where they go on Israel-Palestine, I'll still vote for them. And I think the Biden camp does feel that way about the people who are the most progressive on Israel-Palestine. On the other hand, I will say that they did make sure, they actually, if you look at the Democratic platform, their language on, say, BDS, I personally am not someone who advocates BDS. I absolutely defend the right. It's free speech, 100%. And at this point, I spend most of my time defending the right of people to engage in political free speech, including boycotts. And interestingly, the Biden camp did make sure that there was a nod to free speech in the platform. And that's something that is important. I don't expect them to spend political capital out there getting in front defending, people's right to boycott what they want to boycott. I wish they would defend boycotts as free speech. That would make this easier for everyone and de-exceptionalize this. But the giving the nod to free speech, that's something that's quite important.
Mm-hmm. Well, Lara, we're getting a lot of questions from the audience, so I think I'm going to turn it over to Gabriella, and I will talk to you later.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jacqueline. So I'm going to ask a question from Ken Victor, and he says, could you play out a scenario of what might happen with the US-Israel relationship if there are another 4 years of Trump? So I almost want to say Hasbet Halila.
Look, it's an absolutely fair question. I am something of a broken record when it comes to my analysis of the Trump administration. This is going to sound like I'm trying to say like I'm so smart. I have the distinction of actually having, except for the question of when they're going to come out actively in support of annexation, I've predicted correctly everything the Trump administration has done since he was elected. And it's not because I'm psychic or because I'm the smartest analyst in the world. It's because I believed them. I believed them when they said what they were going to do. This administration is a deeply ideological administration when it comes to Israel-Palestine. They're not making decisions based on some national security calculus that says, if you use the national security calculus, which people did, then they would not have moved the embassy. And lots of really smart people wrote articles about how they talked about moving the embassy, but they would never do it. And people wrote really smart articles about how they talked about supporting, Judea and Samaria, but they would be tougher on settlements than Obama. And all those people were wrong. They have done exactly what they would say. They have systematically taken the permanent status issues off the table. They have systematically erased the Oslo process. They have systematically marginalized and delegitimized the Palestinian leadership and even the Palestinian narrative itself to take us where we are today, where we have a peace plan, which is in effect a description of the status quo with a prescription that it should just be deepened, that this status quo should be deepened and legitimized. If I'm going to look to the next 4 years, I'm going to take very seriously David Friedman and Sheldon Adelson, whose dream is greater Israel recognized by the United States, right? And it's Israel, and there is no Palestine, and there are no Palestinians. We're already implementing that systematically. To not believe that that's where they will continue to go, is not a rational conclusion. I mean, you have to actually, it actually requires a leap of faith to believe that they would do anything else. All logic dictates that they will continue the path they're on. And that path ends with one state. And it ends with something that looks a lot like apartheid, as Michael Svard, I'm sure you guys saw it, came out with his paper finally calling it apartheid in the West Bank. If you look at the Trump plan is an apartheid plan. But we'll call it something else and we'll say it's okay. And when I challenge, when I come out, even now, when I come out on Twitter and say exactly what I've just said to you, the defenders of the status quo and the defenders of essentially what the Trump plan looks like on the ground, they don't really argue with me that that's the solution that they're aiming at. What they say are things like, well, America's not perfect because people in some of the territory, because people in DC don't get to vote for Congress, right? It's what I call the holding Israel to the worst possible standard. We'll search around the world and find the worst case of a violation of democracy, and then we'll say, listen, other countries get away with it too, so what we're doing at the West Bank is fine. And if you don't agree with us, that means you're anti-Semitic. And that's what the next 4 years are going to look like. Gabriella, you're muted.
Yeah. I'm here. All right, your last comment sort of is a good segue to another question that we received, and that is, and you've spoken to it a little bit, but maybe you could address it some more. Can you speak to the effect of this comes from, by the way, Marla Keys Savage. Can you speak to the effect of chastising progressives in Congress as anti-Semitic for questioning Israel policy on the potential alienation of unaffiliated Jews? So I guess what she's asking is this pushing Jews, unaffiliated Jews, even to become more alienated, I guess.
It's a great question. I think there's probably polling someplace that could answer. I can answer it intuitively, and intuitively I would say absolutely. You know, it's not for nothing that, you know, in the past, 4 years, maybe longer, but certainly the past 4 years, if not now, Jewish Voice for Peace. The idea that, again, this goes back to the Barry Weiss article, that American Jews are being given a black and white choice between embracing illiberalism or being called anti-Semites. That's a choice that most American Jews are very uncomfortable with and are continuing to challenge. I will say for me, watching what are effectively the most exciting politicians of my generation, right? Well, younger than me, but or like watching the Women's March, Dream Defenders, Black Lives Matter. But these are the most exciting grassroots movements of my lifetime. And all of them are being attacked using the criticism of Israel as a hook to call people anti-Semitic. It's extraordinary. And I will say, as a progressive American Jew, I think it's indefensible. And it's so cynical. That isn't to say that there is not anti-Semitism amongst progressives. There's anti-Semitism everywhere in the world, right? There's also racism everywhere in the world. There's Islamophobia. It's the question of, do we insist on exceptionalizing this? And do we insist, whereas when a settler commits an act of violence, we say, okay, but you can't extrapolate and say all settlers are violent or all Israelis are violent. And I absolutely agree. You cannot extrapolate that. And I am someone who I find myself defending settlers, when I hear these things said. By the same token, if someone during a protest for Black Lives Matter decides to tag a wall, Free Palestine, doesn't mean Black Lives Matter is anti-Semitic. And by the way, Free Palestine is not an anti-Semitic statement. It's a political statement. It's very demoralizing to see this.
Thanks. So I have two questions here that are somewhat related. So I'll give you them both. One comes from David Brooks, and he's asking, what do the Palestinian community in Israel and Palestine think about the two candidates? And maybe this is another question from Howard Mintz. Are there any Arab American? No, I guess that's a different question. I'll ask you that afterwards.
But the first question I can dispense with really easily, which is I do not speak for Palestinians. I would encourage you to get a Palestinian who can answer that for you. I am very conscious, and I've become much more conscious in recent years of how often progressive Jews are asked to stand in and speak for Palestinians, and I won't do it.
Okay. All right. Then the next question is from Howard Mintz, and he wants to know, are there any Arab American organizations that support a two-state solution for Israel-Palestine?
That's an interesting question. So for years, I mean, you had the American Task Force on Palestine, ATFP, which existed in Washington and was active, and for what it's worth, it didn't have, it was lovely, and it's gone away. It doesn't exist anymore because I don't know, it doesn't exist anymore. Arab American Institute, I don't know if they have an outright position on two states, but they've been strongly supportive of peace efforts, strongly supportive of, really when US policy has been engaged in a constructive way. I feel like at this point, it's funny. We held a panel. My organization did a panel a couple of years ago for the Nakba Day. My organization is not a Jewish organization, so I can organize a panel of Palestinians to talk about the Nakba, and I can organize a panel of American Jews to talk about, Israeli things. I'm allowed to do that. It's a lot of fun. And so you had this panel of Palestinians and Palestinian Americans talking about their narrative and their experience, and someone in the audience basically got up and sort of demanded that they express their fealty to the two-state solution as to accredit them. And I actually intervened at that point. I'd been staying sort of in the background because it seemed irrelevant to me, and it seemed unfair because, you know what, we have an Israeli government that doesn't support the two-state solution. We have an American government that doesn't support the two-state solution, and we have Palestinians living under occupation. So demanding that Palestinians come out and check this box seems, it seems unreasonable to me. The US doesn't check that box anymore in any meaningful way, and the Israelis don't check it really at all. My experience working this issue is that when there is a viable peace process, and when the US and the Israeli government are serious about trying to achieve a two-state solution, from the grassroots level, Arab Americans, Jewish Americans, everyone, people support it. There isn't a two-state solution to support right now. There is a two-state dream to support, and maybe we get back to it and it gets some flesh on it. But at this point, you look at the map and you think, what is there to support? This is something Peace Now spends a lot of time trying to explain to people why you have to look at the map. It isn't enough to say, I support two states. Just like it isn't enough to say, I oppose annexation. Opposing the word annexation is lovely. It makes people feel good. They look in the mirror and say, I oppose annexation. I'm a good person. If you don't actually oppose the policies that are implementing annexation every day, opposing the word is irrelevant. And saying you support two states, if you're not willing to stand up and fight the things that are preventing it, and then demanding the other side say, express fealty to the word while you're not doing anything to make that word have meaning. Again, it's nice, you can look in the mirror and feel good about yourself, but it's not serious. Most Palestinians on the ground today, there was just a poll that came out, I think it's the lowest percentage right now, are saying they support two states. Does that mean that 70%, whatever the percentage is, believe in their hearts that Israel shouldn't exist and they want all the land? Or does it mean that they've actually given up in the belief that there's any possibility, that this now seems just like a ridiculous term, why are you even asking me? I'm pretty sure it's the latter. And I'm pretty sure if there was, whether it's the Biden administration or something else, something that brought a two-state solution back as a real possibility, I'm pretty sure, just like you saw with Oslo, you would very quickly see significant support across the board and across communities.
Thank you. Okay, our next question comes from Awad Lubani. Hi, Awad, I know it. What would the reaction be, and I assume he means the American or the reaction of both the different candidates, to a unity strategy by Abbas and Hamas? So, yeah.
It's a great question. I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration isn't interested in dealing with the PA and the PLO as currently organized, and that if there was a unity strategy, I mean, you already have people in this administration because of the funding for Palestinian prisoners and families of Palestinians who've been killed by Israel. You already have a clear policy which says the PA and the PLO support terror, right? That's the delegitimization of the leadership I was talking about. So if you were to have a unity strategy that actually brought Hamas into government, I don't think it's a great distance to go to say, aha, see, we told you they were terrorists. I think that's very clear. Under a Biden administration, would there, after all of these years of sort of pushing Hamas to the side and allowing it to play spoiler, would you see a more, I don't know, nuanced strategy which says, more like IRA style strategy, you give up your weapons. As one of my mentors, Galia Golan of Peace Now, said, back in the day when they were going to Tunis to meet with the PLO, back when it was illegal, the argument was, put down your weapons and come to the table. The only condition for coming to the table is putting down your weapons, because that's how you bring people from the stage of fighting to the stage of negotiating. Could we see something like that? I think it's possible. I'm not super optimistic. I will say the normalization trend in the region right now is clearly pushing the Palestinians towards unity, towards reconciliation. With the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian national cause facing what it feels, I think, in some ways like an existential threat to the very cause. I think that's pushing all those parties into unity. If people, are concerned about that, the answer is then you need to engage them in a serious way, which doesn't mean threatening them and saying accept the apartheid outcome. If Biden wins and there is a new approach that says this is a way to re-engage with the Palestinians more like status quo ante, I actually tend to think that would push them in the direction of not having unity and reconciliation. As an analyst, that's my guess. But we'll see. I mean, the ideological differences haven't gone away between Hamas and Fatah. Nothing has changed. What's changed is whether or not they feel like they can survive on their own.
Thank you. So next question is kind of follows through on that. This comes from Bob Katz, one of our board members, and he says, assuming Biden wins, what in your opinion is the most desirable outcome towards an equitable settlement that is realistic and possible? So what is your best case scenario here?
I don't even know how to articulate one anymore. I mean, it's very hard for me at this moment. I'm a political analyst. I'm not somebody, there are people who excel in imagining, the impossible and then making it so. And that's not my skill set. I look at where we are right now, and what I observe is that absent an enormous expenditure of political capital, which includes clashing with the Israeli government, assuming we continue to have a Bibi government or a Bennett government, something to the right, there's going to be clashing. That expenditure of political capital is going to be necessary because nothing is preventing them from continuing to go ahead with the de facto annexation on the ground. If you're someone who believes in two states, then preserving two states means stopping the de facto annexation and rolling a lot of it back. And there's nothing right now to convince Israel to do that. And if a Biden administration comes in, unless they change that calculus, then things continue that way on the ground. And it's hard for me to see how you get back to two states. And I don't see one state as being a plausible outcome at this point. And so that just sounds like more violence to me. I don't know where this goes. The question, if Biden wins, the question that he has to be challenged with is, what does it truly mean to be someone who cares about Israel? Is it simply about the qualitative military edge? Is it simply about defending Israel from criticism as it drives itself off a cliff? Okay, then we know where that goes. And it doesn't look that different from the Trump policy. It's the Trump policy, but a little bit smoothed down to be a little more palatable. If caring about Israel means caring about democracy and human rights and rule of law and recognizing that a stable situation in the region is not going to be found by Israel making peace with Arab countries with which it is not at war, but actually making peace with the people that it lives side by side with, cheek to jowl with, where it's going to, Bibi is now talking peace for peace. Think about that language, right? It's so attractive. Peace for peace means that Israel doesn't have to give up anything except stop, you cease the sense of belligerency. You guys stop hating us, we'll stop hating you, and we'll all get along. Well, peace for peace to the Palestinians means apartheid. And that isn't good for Israel or for the Palestinians. So I have to hope that setting aside all the cynical political calculations, I have to hope the next administration actually cares about Israel and what kind of state it is, and actually cares about Palestinians and doesn't just see them as an inconvenient political reality they have to navigate. That's my hope.
Okay. So here comes the question from a little, say the and it's from Erez Aji. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. I think I'll paraphrase that, and basically he's asking whether if there's pressure from the international community on the Palestinians, whether that will change things for the better. In other words, I think there's an assumption here that perhaps the Palestinians have not heard a clear enough message from the international community.
Look, I mean, pressure on both parties is going to be key. Look, there's pressure on the Palestinians right now from Europe on the question of accepting the tax revenues that Israel, the tax revenues that belong to the PA that Israel is holding on to and passes through to them. And the Palestinian Authority is part of its boycotting of Israel right now, partly because Israel is deducting from those tax revenues, is just not accepting them. And Israel is under the Palestinians are under tremendous pressure from Europe now to start accepting them, partly because Europe is saying, we keep footing the bill for everything, and you're saying no to this money, that's ridiculous. Look, that pressure has to play a role. But if it's only pressure on the Palestinians, while every day more settlements are approved, more settlements are built, status quo changes on the Temple Mount, the international community, is standing by Israel as it denies movement and access for Palestinians from Gaza, you can have all the pressure you want. I don't know what a Palestinian Authority is going to do. The PA in the current moment has very little credibility with the Palestinian people. A government gets credibility by doing what? If you're in a situation like the Palestinians, you can have credibility because you negotiate, and by negotiating get people a better life, or you can have credibility by leading the fight to end the oppression, what the Palestinians see as oppression. And the PA is doing neither, because thankfully they oppose violence. That's a wonderful thing, and I wish people treasured that a little more, because I'm old enough to remember what both intifadas were like. So you don't have them fighting occupation, and there's no place to negotiate. I mean, if the idea is you pressure the Palestinians so that their authority accepts the Trump plan, under which they basically are giving a kosher stamp to apartheid, I have a bridge to sell you. And by the way, if you could find a Palestinian Authority that could be pressured into doing that, it would be overthrown. That authority would not have legitimacy. So, I mean, yes, there is an absolute role for pressure on the Palestinians. It has to be in tandem with real pressure on Israel. And up until now, for the past 25 years or so, the imbalance of pressure has been very, very clear. There has been a lack of political will to hold Israel accountable for any of its actions in the occupation. And that is not an anti-Israel statement, that is a statement of fact. And frankly, if I am Bibi Netanyahu behaving the way I have for the past, since certainly the beginning of Obama, I mean, it would be irrational for him to not be doing what he's doing. He's gotten away with it, and not only does he get away with it, but he just gets more and more. The US Congress right now is sitting on the National Defense Authorization Act, which will be passed maybe after the election, probably not before, just because of timing. And that bill has more aid for Israel in it than anything that has ever been contemplated. It's the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding under Obama, codified into law so that nobody can use aid as leverage with Israel ever, right? It's codified into law, but it's codified as a floor, not a ceiling, explicitly, as in this is the minimum, but not the maximum. And then it includes, armloads of benefits that have never been contemplated. And this is what Congress was looking at the exact moment that it looked like Israel was about to annex. As people were making statements against annexation, they were also voting in favor of this legislation. That's not pressure. And that's bipartisan, by the way. Let's be really clear, that's bipartisan.
Okay. So I think we still have room for audience questions if anybody wants to bring in some more. I'm going to ask one of my own because this hasn't come up yet. And then I might give a heads up to Jacqueline. You probably have time for one more question after mine. And that is, what role is the evangelical movement playing in this election, and in relation to the Israel issue? How important is it to them what happens in Israel? And is that moving their vote at all? Or, yeah.
It's a really important question. I did a webinar with an expert on the evangelicals a few weeks ago. I interviewed her. This is something that I find fascinating. It is very clear, and we've known this for a long time, those of us who work Washington and see how the Israel issue operates in Washington, and the rise of Christians United for Israel and Reverend Hagee and all that. I don't know if you guys know about him. I mean, for a very long time, we have been seeing the gradual expansion of an evangelical bloc which identifies itself in terms of its views on Israel, right? And its views on Israel are far to the right of the mainstream of the American Jewish community. We are at a moment now, though, where, I mean, there was a recent event, I saw a video of it online, where President Trump was speaking to an evangelical crowd, and he basically said, "I moved the embassy for you." Like, the Jews don't care, but I moved it for you. The confluence of interests here, and the readiness of Israel to align itself with hardline evangelicals. I mean, these are end times people. I strongly recommend to people there's a movie that just came out. I'm blanking on the name of it, about the evangelicals in Israel. An Israeli documentary maker just made it, looking at this. And these are, you know, the whole dispensationalist, you know, end time stuff. I mean, okay, fine. If it doesn't bother you, that's fine that you're making alliances with people who are trying to, you know, be there to make sure that when you die in a pool of fire, they go to heaven with Jesus. And that's their prerogative. But we're at a point now where the Israeli government appears to have written off American Jews entirely, except for the Orthodox or the very politically conservative, and is really caring more about evangelicals. I'll give you just as an example for folks who didn't see it. During COVID, Israel basically shut its borders to tourists, right? The tourism industry has taken a huge hit. You know, unless you're an Israeli, you couldn't travel, except that they made an exception for a big group of evangelicals who came to help out in the harvest for the settlements. A group called Hayovel. It was all over the news. They got a special permit to bring in this huge group of evangelicals. I mean, that's a special relationship. There's no question that Mr. Trump cares about that constituency for his reelection. That's part of his hardcore constituency. And there's no question that constituency puts policy on Israel right up there with abortion and gay rights, opposing them. You know, there's a handful of issues which are at the beating heart of this constituency. And hardline greater Israel policy is part of that.
Okay, sorry, Jacqueline, another audience question has come through here. And this is from Harold Forrester. Would it be possible or feasible to establish Palestinian territories such as provinces within Israel that would give the residents in those territories enough legal rights to satisfy most of them? So I don't know.
So I'm going to presume that this is a question being asked in good, trying to be creative and all of that. Fundamentally, if the idea is you're going to establish provinces where the people living in those provinces do not enjoy the full rights of citizens that live around them based on their ethnicity, you are describing Bantustans. And I would argue morally that is a non-starter, or should be a non-starter. And I would argue strategically, politically, it creates an unstable situation. I would argue that morally it is indefensible. I don't know how Israel could claim. Israel still claims to be a democracy, and it is a challenging argument to make. If you look at it and say, fine, within 48, Israel is democratic. Don't think about East Jerusalem and don't think about the West Bank. And that's an argument that I made for many years. But at the point when Israel is making clear as a matter of policy, it never intends to let go of the West Bank. It's hard to argue that you shouldn't hold it accountable for how it governs East Jerusalem and the West Bank. This isn't temporary. I mean, the idea that you can call Israel a democracy and set the West Bank aside is predicated on the belief that Israel's presence in the West Bank is temporary. And every day now, Israeli politicians tell you, we will never leave Judea and Samaria. It is ours forever. It's Eretz Yisrael. At which point it's very questionable when you start talking about democratic Israel. And if you care about Israel being a democracy, and I do, I want Israel to be democratic. That's important to me, and it's important to my support for Israel. Then Israel cannot continue down this road. And the answer is not to find some way to soften the blow and say, well, it's not entirely apartheid. It's sort of like, you know, it's still at the point. Think of whether or not you would be willing to live in that situation. Think about whether or not you think anywhere in the world you would have an ethnic group willing to live with less rights within a state which has overall dominance over it, and not call that a violation of your rights, and let alone your violation of your right to self-determination. That's a non-starter.
Okay, so we have time for just one more quick question, if Jacqueline wants to give one, and a very quick answer, and then we should need to wrap up. So make it a quick one. Jacqueline, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, I had two questions. One is mine.
One question,
okay, well, I feel guilty because, well, this is a Jewish thing. So of course, one is going to feel guilty about something, but our board member Reuben sent me a question this afternoon. I didn't think I'd have enough time. He wants to know about the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act of 2018 and what it reveals about how obstacles to peace are instituted through the benign sounding measures.
So, wow, that's way in the weeds for someone who's not living in the United States. I'm impressed. ATCA, the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act, is a little tiny piece of law that nobody paid attention to, except for me, who was screaming hair on fire for months trying to get people to pay attention to it. And it was bipartisan, and everyone supported it, because all this was doing was saying we're closing a loophole for these bad terrorists. And effectively what this benign piece of language did, it was supported by lawfare organizations that were seeking to create a hook to allow Americans to sue the PA and the PLO in US courts. And it passed into law, and immediately it forced the US to cut off all aid to Palestinians, because the Palestinians, if they accepted $1 of aid, that meant they were accepting the jurisdiction of US courts, which is a non-starter. It was eventually amended after a lot of political capital was invested so that aid can still go, but it still is a barrier to reopening the PLO mission. And what it tells you about bad things happening through benign means is, yeah. It also tells you that people hear what they want to hear. They were warned about this. They were warned about the Taylor-Force Act. I've been telling people since the Taylor-Force Act was first introduced, that's the bill that makes us cut off aid because of the pay to slay, which says if the Palestinians are giving $1 to the families of people who are in jail or families of people who are killed by Israel, that means they're supporting terrorism, and it's all that. And I said from day one, this isn't about cutting US aid. This is about labeling the PA and the PLO as terrorist organizations. Be careful what you do. And that passed into law. And we've already had one effort in US court to use that as a hook to label the PA and PLO a terrorist organization and go after NGOs that work in the West Bank that way. All of this is pretty obvious if you're paying attention. The problem is if you're a member of Congress and someone says, this is anti-terrorist and pro-Israel, if that's enough and you're going to stop paying attention and stop listening, then bad things are going to keep passing into law. And the fact is that, if you stand up on these things, you're going to get hit. And we've seen this with the free speech issue in BDS, where members of Congress who do stand up, we have a lot of efforts to pass anti-BDS legislation, which is brazenly unconstitutional. This is in US states, and legislation to support it in Congress. And the members who get up and say, listen, I oppose BDS, I love Israel, I'm on board with this, but this is unconstitutional, they get attacked for being anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. I mean, this is the game people are playing. And if you're not going to spend the political capital to stand up for what you really believe in, you're going to keep getting snookered. And then we all pay the price.
So, well, we've pretty much run out of time. I just want to, the person, Harold Forrester, wanted to clarify that he never meant for Palestinians to have fewer rights, but rather to be more in the situation of Quebec, Quebec and Canada, different rules. So just so to set that record straight.
So I would just add for Harold, he should check. I mean, there are actually some initiatives coming from Israel. Two peoples, one state, two states. I forget the name of it. There's a few initiatives that actually look a little bit like that I think are worth exploring. They're really interesting. My challenge to that, I say, if you're willing to do all the work to do that, you could just get two states. That's actually, I don't see why that's easier to get to than two states. But there's a lot of very creative work being done on sort of the confederation or two peoples living as sort of separate political entities but living together. There's interesting work on that being done.
Right. Well, alas, we are at the end of our hour, so I'm going to ask Jacqueline to please wrap it up and then thank our guests for us. Yeah.
This has been really great. And thank you, Lara, for giving us both the big picture and terrific provocative perspectives, and also the weeds as well. I only wish that you will have a voice in the upcoming Biden administration.
I can guarantee that won't happen.
Thank you very much. We feel that you're sort of part of the Peace Now family, and maybe one day we will have you actually in person in Toronto.
That would be nice.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for participating and watching. And stay tuned for future webinars. And once again, if you are able to give us a donation, we would be so pleased. And thank you. See you next time.